soldiers of the cities of Sigmar wear the uniform and heraldry of their city with pride. In this video, we'll be showing you how to paint that uniform and heraldry of the troops from the recklessly aggressive Greywater fastness. If you're new to painting, you can check out the Citadel Colour Painting Essentials videos to learn all about painting Warhammer. All the paints you'll need for this guide are on screen now, but remember, these are just our suggestions. These are your miniatures and you can paint them however you like. Also on screen now is any additional equipment we've used. This includes brushes and mediums. However, feel free to use whatever brushes you're most comfortable with, and if you haven't got mediums at home, you could use water instead. So for this video, we've got a free guild steel helm built and undercoated using Wraithbone. This is a really warm undercoat, so that'll give us a great head start on this colour scheme. So the first thing we're going to do is paint that shield, and for the wood, we're going to use a Shabti bone. Now this is a layer paint, but we can absolutely use these for base coating too. They're just generally slightly thinner, so you might need an extra layer or two. Add your paint to your palette and thin it down with some water. This will make sure that we don't clog up all that fine detail. Make sure it's not too watery though, as this won't settle on the miniature correctly. Don't worry about being neat here, we'll be painting all the other details later anyway. Just make sure you get into all those tricky to reach areas. And don't forget to paint the back of the shield too. Next, we'll be applying a shade all over that shield, and for this we're going to use Cassandora Yellow. You'll see that this adds a really nice warm yellow tone to the shield. It's best to work in small sections so that it dries evenly. And if you find the shade is pooling too much in any recesses, clean off your brush and use that to soak up any excess. Again, you really don't need to worry about being neat here. Just make sure you get into all the tricky to reach areas. We do this stage now so that we don't have to worry about being neat. And once that shade is fully dry, we're now going to dry brush the wood. For this, we'll be using Screaming Skull and a small dry brush. A small dry brush here works really well as it helps get into all those tricky areas. Adding a Screaming Skull dry brush here will help to create a natural looking highlight. It'll also help the wood look more worn and like it's seen battle. When we're dry brushing, it's really important to make sure we remove as much paint off the brush as possible. So we can use a paper towel or a piece of cardboard, and we can wipe the paint onto this before we apply it to a miniature. Here we're just applying it to a piece of paper towel in circular and crisscross motions until we've just got a small amount of paint left on the brush. Then we move the brush over the raised details on the wood. We do this very gently so that we create a subtle highlight. You might want to dry brush a little bit more heavily towards the bottom of the shield, as this will help add to the weathering effect. Next, we'll move on to painting the trim, and for this we'll be using Corvus Black. This is a base paint, so we need to add it to our palette and thin it down with some water. Then we'll build up a couple of thin layers. When we're doing this, it's good to be a little bit more careful here, as we've already painted some details. So just take your time and work your way around the trim, being as neat as you can. But don't worry if you make any mistakes, you can just tidy up by following the previous steps. You might want to switch to a smaller brush here. Something like a small layer brush would work really well, as it gives you a bit more control. And next we're going to paint the middle of the shield using Corax White. Again, we'll need to add this to the palette and thin it down with some water. Then we'll build up a few thin layers. Make sure you allow each layer to fully dry before you move on to the next one. If we're trying to paint over paint that isn't quite dry yet, this could create unwanted texture. Now we'll add a shade over that white area. For this, we'll be using Seraphim Sepia and we'll be thinning it down with Lamia Medium. We do this so that it's more subtle and doesn't overpower that base coat. It also helps it to flow a little bit better. For this, we'll be using 1 part Lamia Medium and 1 part Seraphim Sepia. This does make our paint flow a little bit more, so just be careful that it doesn't run out of control when we apply it to the miniature. And again, if there's any excess pooling anywhere, clean off your brush and use that to soak up that excess. Now, if you'd like to take this paint job up a notch, you can add an edge highlight to the trim of the shield. For this, we'll be using Administratum Grey. When you're edge highlighting, try and make sure you've got a really stable painting position. You'll also need to make sure that you keep a really good point on your brush, as this will help you be neat. Wherever you can, use the edge of your brush to glide that along any hard edges on our miniature. This creates a really quick and easy highlight. You might find you need to move the miniature around quite a lot to get the best angle. And don't worry if you do make any mistakes, it's super easy to just tidy back up with some thinned down Corvus Black. Just take your time and work your way around that trim, picking out as many of the edges as you like. We can also add an edge highlight to that middle area, and for this we're going to use white scar. Follow the same steps as you did with the trim. Just make sure you've got that stable painting position and that you just take your time working your way around the edges. You'll also want to make sure that the paint is thinned down enough. We want it to glide effortlessly off the brush, but we don't want it too thin that it becomes quite watery, as this wouldn't settle when we paint it onto the miniature. And now we can see our shield is finished and looking awesome. So we're going to move on to the tunic next. The Grey Water Fastness troops wear a yellow tunic, so we're going to base coat using Avalon Sunset. Again, this is a base paint, so thin it down and apply a few thin layers. This avoids clogging up any detail. It's up to you what size brush you want to use here. We're using a small base brush, but you might find it easier to switch to a smaller one for those trickier to reach areas. And with that base coat dry, we can now apply a shade all over it. We're going to be using Cassandora Yellow again. This adds lots of subtle depth to that yellow without overpowering that base coat. Again, we'll want to apply this heavily and neatly. It's also a good idea to work in small sections, as this avoids the paint drying unevenly. And as always with a shade, make sure you control any excess pooling. And the final thing we're going to do is edge highlight the tunic using Screaming Skull. Again, we'll use a small layer brush here, as this will give us the most control. Just make sure you've got a good point on your brush and just take your time picking out any of that raised detail. If you make any mistakes, thin down some Avalon Sunset and just use that to go back over the area. This might look quite bright when you first apply the highlight, but don't worry, once it's dry, it'll look much more subtle. And there we are. Now you know how to paint the distinctive colours of the Grey Water Fastness troops, and you'll have some awesomely painted miniatures before you know it. We've applied a transfer to the shield just to finish it off, and if you'd like to learn more about using transfers, you can check out our video all about them. For more tutorials, tips and tricks, you can head to your local Warhammer store where our amazing staff will be more than happy to help, or head on over to citadelcolour.com. Well, we hope you've enjoyed the video and we'll see you next time. Bye!